Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to continue our discussion regarding factoring by grouping. We're going to review the previous lesson in which the GCF was 1, and then we're going to look at examples where the GCF is not 1. Okay, so let's kind of review number 1. So number 1, we have x squared plus 3x minus 6x minus 18. All right, now remember, when you have 4 terms, you want to try to factor by grouping. That's the procedure you want to use. Now, chances are it's not always true though, but for our case at this point, when you factor by grouping, we're going to group the first 2 and we're going to group the last 2 terms. All right, so always try those first. Try the first 2 first and try the last 2. Okay, now when you look at the first group, so you may want to just kind of forget about this part for right now, but if you look at that first group, what is the GCF of that first group, meaning the first 2 terms? So if you look at the first 2 terms, the GCF is x. So that means I can factor out an x from the first group. And so when I do that, I get x times, and remember when you factor, you're writing as a product, so you're factoring out in the x, so you're going to say x times some polynomial that gives us this back. So just think about the distributive property. So x times what is x squared, so that's x, and then plus, and then x times what is 3x, so that will be just 3. So if you look at this, if you kind of distribute the monomial x here, you're going to get this back. All right, now let's look at the next one. So remember in the previous lesson, you always want to factor out that middle sign right here. So since that's a subtraction, you want to factor out a negative GCF. So let's cover this part up now. And so when you look at this part, the GCF of this part here, 6x and negative 6x and negative 18, is a negative 6. I'm going to factor out a negative 6. And so when you factor, you're writing it as a product. So negative 6 times what binomial? So you have 2 terms here, so you better have 2 terms here. Negative 6 times what binomial gives us this back? All right, so negative 6 times x gives us negative 6x. So just think about the distributive property. And then remember, negative times a positive is a positive. Negative times a positive is a negative. So we get plus, and then that would be 3 here. And so if you're doing this correctly, if this is factored by grouping, then these 2 parts here should have the same common factor. And so notice that they have an x plus 3 in common. All right, so what that means then is that I can factor out an x plus 3. So you have an x plus 3 here and x plus 3 here. So you can factor an x plus 3. So I'm going to get equal x plus 3 times, now remember when you factor out an x plus 3, so when you factor out the x plus 3, you're left with x. So times it makes you put parentheses, times x, and then when you factor out an x plus 3 here, you're left with minus 6. All right, and so there's your answer. Now before we go on, remember part of the factoring is to factor completely. So see you have 2 factors here. Your factors are x plus 3 and x minus 6. Make sure, always double check to make sure you can't factor that any further. So if you look at x plus 3, what's the GCF of x plus 3? GCF is 1. If you look at x minus 6, what's the GCF? The GCF is 1. So you're good to go. All right, so that's number 1. Number 2, let's suppose we had this. We had 2ax squared minus c x squared plus 6a minus 3c. All right, so again, notice you have 4 terms. You have 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you have 4 terms, you want to try to factor by grouping. And so always try this first. Always try by grouping the first 2 and the last 2. If that doesn't work, you're going to have to rearrange some terms. All right, and if that still doesn't work, then that means that this could not be factored. You would say prime. All right, but always try the first 2, always try the second 2 first. The first 2, last 2. All right, now once you group them, you may need to cover up the other group for right now. So look at that first group, those 2 terms. What's the GCF of those 2 terms? What do those 2 terms have in common? And remember, you always want to use the greatest common factor, the GCF. So if you look at this, these two terms, they have an x squared in common. That's about it, right? So that's the GCF, x squared. So I'm going to factor out an x squared. So when I factor out the x squared, remember you're writing as a product, so x squared times what? And I see you have two terms, so that binomial, so you need a binomial here. So x squared times what term gives me 2a x squared? So the answer is 2a, because x squared times 2a is this. Minus, so subtract, x squared times what will give me cx squared. So remember, you took out an x squared, so you're left with c. All right, and so always check by distributing. X squared times 2a is 2a squared, ax squared. X squared times a negative c is a negative cx squared. All right, now let's go to the next one. So over here, remember, always factor out the whenever you're doing grouping, always factor out that middle sign. So I'm gonna factor out a positive GCF here. So if you look at 6a and negative 3c, what's the GCF? Well, the GCF is 3. So I'm going to factor out a positive 3, though. And so always think, 3 times what is 6a? Well, that's 2a. And then 3 times what's a negative 3c? Well, that's just minus c. All right, now if you're doing this correctly, see how those two factors are identical? So that, remember, that's not your answer because you want to write your answer as a product. You got to write as a product of factors, just like you did here. See, this is not a product of factors. You have this being a product and this being a product, but you see that addition symbol? That's our issue. All right, so you got to go further. So that means you can go further. So if you look at 2a minus c, the 2a minus c is a factor in both of those. So that means I can factor that out. And so I'm going to get 2a in parentheses times, now remember, you factor out the 2a minus c, you have x squared left. And then you factor out the 2a minus c, you have plus 3 left. And so there's your answer. So your two factors are 2a minus c and x squared plus 3. Now again, make sure before you go any further, you check your factors to make sure you can't factor anything else. All right, so the GCF of 2a minus c is 1, and the GCF of x squared plus 3 is 1. So you're good. All right, number 3. So number 3, we have xy minus 5y minus 2x plus 10. All right, so xy minus 5y minus 2x plus 10. All right, so again, you have 4 terms. Remember, your terms are xy, negative 5y, negative 2x, and positive 10. All right, and so always try grouping by doing the first 2 and the last 2. And again, if that doesn't work, you're going to rearrange terms. So first 2, last 2. Now in the first group, again, cover up, if that other part bothers you, cover it up. In the first group, what do they have in common? Well, they have a y in common, right? See, there's a y here and a y here, so that's your GCF. So I'm going to factor out a y, so when I factor out the y, I'm going to get y times what is xy? Well, x minus, and then y times what's negative 5y? Well, negative 5. All right, now let's go to the next one. So you see I factored this as a product. All right, so y times x minus y. Now let's go to the next one. Now remember, you got to always factor out that middle sign. Now, if you look at these two terms, which is GCF, a negative 2. So you're going to factor out a negative 2. Now to factor out negative 2, negative 2 times what's a negative 2x? Well, positive x. And then negative 2 times what's a positive 10? Well, a negative 5. Because a negative times a negative is a positive. And if I'm doing this correctly, these two should be the same. Okay? All right, and so therefore, I can factor out the x minus 5. So I get x minus 5 times, remember you factor x minus 5, you're left with y minus 2. Y minus 2. All right. So that was a quick review of a previous lesson. Now let's look at number 4. So now what we're going to look at is situations where the GCF is not 1. So if you look at at all 4 terms right here, if you look at all 4 terms, the GCF of all 4 terms is 1. Okay? Over here, the GCF of all 4 terms, 2ax squared minus cx squared plus 6a minus 3c, they're all 1. The GCF is 1. Each term, they don't have a common factor other than 1. But when we look at number 4, I want to show you something. In number 4, though, watch what happens. So this is number 4. So number 4, we have 2x squared plus 8x plus 10xy plus 40y. Okay? So 2x squared plus 8xy plus 10xy plus 40y. Now remember, whenever you're factoring, you always must look for the GCF first. Okay? So if you look at these 4 terms, is the GCF 1 or something else? So notice the coefficients. That's a 2, that's an 8, that's a 10, that's a 40. They're all even. So obviously, they're going to have at least a 2 as a common factor. And is that the largest? Yeah, because the smallest you see here is 2. All right, now look at your variables. Do every term have the same variable? No. These have x's, all x's, and these 2 have y's. But all 4 terms don't have the same variables in them. So the GCF is 2. The GCF is 2. So remember, what you want to do is factor out the 2 first. So we're going to say 2 times, I'm going to put this in bracket, so 2 times x squared is 2x squared, plus 2 times 4x, right? So 2 times 4x is 8x, and then plus 2 times what's 10xy? Well, 5xy, plus, and then 2 times what's 40y? Well, 20y. Okay? Now what you want to do is now look at this part. So you factor out the GCF, which was 2. So I'm going to cover this up, and now look at this. So you see, now you're going to do this by grouping, because the GCF of these 4 terms is now 1. All right, now if I factor by grouping, now remember you got to bring down the 2, because that's part of the answer. So if you factor this by grouping, I'm going to group the first 2 and the last 2. All right, and so over here, I'm going to put this in brackets for right now. Over here, I can factor out an x, so I get x times x plus 4. Y'all agree? Because x times x is x squared, and then x times a positive 4 is 4x. Over here, you're going to factor out a positive, and then if you look at this, they both have a y, and what else do they both have? A 5, right? So the GCF of these 2 terms is 5, and then y. So that would be plus 5y times, and then 5y times what term is 5xy? Well, x, plus, and then 5y times what's 20y? 4. All right, now if you look at just what's inside the bracket, notice I'm covering this 2 up right now. Notice that you have an x plus 4 in common. So that goes back to our first 3 examples. All right, where you had x plus 3, so you factor it out. You had 2a minus c, you factor it out. You had x minus 5, and you factored it out. Same thing here. You have an x plus 4, so you're going to factor it out. So I'm going to get x plus 4 times, and then so if I factor out x plus 4, I get x and then plus 5y. Factor out the x plus 4. So if you take the x plus 4s out, factor it out, see what's left? X plus, see x plus 5y. All right? And then now what you want to do is rewrite this, because don't forget, this right here is a factorization only for this part. But remember, you want to factor the original. So don't forget about the 2. And so what I would do is take the bracket out now, because now you can see that's going to be 2 times x plus, what's that, a 4? And then times x plus 5y. So notice that in number 4, when I factor this, I end up with 3 factors. 2, x plus 4, and then x plus 5y. Okay? All right, now let's suppose though, let's suppose, and listen carefully to this. So remember, the first thing you have to do, or the first thing you should do, I should say, is to factor out the GCF. All right, and we did that. But what if, I'm going to go ahead and rewrite the original problem here. What if, okay, I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this. Because let me just remind you, if you don't factor out the GCF at the beginning, it's no big deal. You're fine. You're still okay. You just got to do something at the end. All right? So what if you forgot about the GCF? All right, okay, so let's see what happens. So we're going to group the first two, we're going to group the last two. All right, and so for the first group, what's the GCF of the first two terms? Well, the GCF of the first two terms is a 2x. All right, so 2x. And so when I factor out the 2x times what's 2x squared? Well, x. And then 2x times what's 8x? That's what, 4? Okay. Then plus. Then if you look at the second group, what do they have in common? What's the GCF? Well, that's a 10, correct? And then what about the variable? Well, the variable y. So that's 10y times, and then think, 10y times what's 10xy? X. And then 10y times what's 40y? And that's plus 4. And then notice these are the same, so I'm going to factor that out. Okay, x plus 4 times, and so when I factor out the x plus 4's right here, notice you have 2x plus 10y left. So 2x plus 10y. Now remember in our previous, and now we're not done, but remember when we came here, we asked ourselves, you got to make sure that those two factors, you factor this completely. So what's the GCF of x plus 3? 1. What's the GCF of x minus 6? 1. All right, let's go to the next one. What's the GCF of 2a minus c? 1. What's the GCF of x plus 3? 1. And we continued on. 1, GCF here is 1. But now look at this. What's the GCF of x plus 4? That's true, it is 1. But what is the GCF of 2x plus 10y? It is 2. So that means that this is not the answer. That's not the answer because you got to make sure that your factors are factored completely. So when you look at this one, that means I can factor out a 2, and I get 2 times x plus 5y. And so therefore, now you see your three factors. See, you're supposed to have three factors as your answer. Now you see them. 1, 2, 3. Except we always put the, now it's, if you write it as the order you see here, it's no big deal, but we always tend to put the monomial factor in front. So I'm going to put the 2 in front. So it'll be 2 times x plus 4 times x plus 5y. So you see, if you forget to factor out the GCF at the beginning, no big deal. You're going to fix it at the end. All right? Okay. Now, don't forget, though, that's not the answer. If you put this as the answer, you're losing some points because you didn't factor completely. See, this factor right here, I can still factor out a 2. The GCF is not 1. The GCF is 2. So you got to factor it out. And so that's where this comes in. So sometimes it's easier if you factor out the beginning rather than waiting at the end because many times students forget about checking, and so they lose some points. All right, so always remember to do that. Okay, let's look at number 5. So number 5, let's suppose we had this in number 5. We had, let's say we had 4x squared y minus 8xy squared minus ax squared y plus 2axy squared. Right, so I know it looks, good Lord, that looks pretty nasty, right? Well, it's not that bad. Okay, so you have how many terms here? You have 4 terms. 1, 2, 3, 4. And so since I have 4 terms, I want to try factoring by grouping. And for us right now, our process is to group the first 2 first and the last 2. Now, even before we do that, what should you have done first? The first thing you should have done was look for a GCF for the whole polynomial. So if you look at this polynomial right here, the GCF is not 1 because notice in terms of the coefficients, that's a 4, that's a negative 8, that's a negative 1, and that's 2. So the GCF of the coefficients is 1. But look at the variables. Do every term have the same variables somehow? Yes, they do. They have x's in all of them, right? And they even have y's in all of them. So if I follow the procedure, the first thing I should do is to factor out the GCF. So the GCF here, if you think about it, the GCF is, let's see, that's x squared x, x squared x, so that's x. That's y, y squared y, y squared, so the GCF is xy. And so I'm going to factor out the GCF, and so when I do that, I get xy xy, and then I'm going to have, how many terms you see here? 4. So how many terms should be in here? 4. Okay? All right, so xy times what term gives me 4x squared y? Well, it'll be 4. X times x is x squared y. And then I already factored the y, so I don't need a y. If you be careful, if you put a y here, you got to check. Y times y is y squared, but that's not a y squared. That's a y. All right, so this times this gives me this. Subtract. All right, xy times what's 8xy squared will be 8. I already factored out the x. I'm factoring out one of the y's, so I'm left with 1y. Okay? Minus. Okay, minus. And then over here, I get from this group, I'm going to get, when I factor out, let's see what they have in common. There's an x. Oh, well, I'm sorry. I'm factoring the xy, right? I'm sorry. So xy times what? I didn't mean to put a parentheses here because what I'm doing is I'm factoring out. Sorry about that. That's not a parentheses. I'm just factoring out xy from all of them. So xy times what is ax squared y. So there, I need an a. I need an x, and I already took out a y. So always check. xy times ax. Does that give me this back? Yes, it does. All right, and then plus xy times y gives me 2axy squared. So I need a 2. I need an a. I already factored out an x, so I don't need an x anymore. I have 2 factors of y here. I'm factoring out one of them, so I need one of them. All right, so if you check, if you were to distribute xy through here, you get this back. All right, now here's what you got to do next. All right, so don't forget, you factor out the xy. So now if you look, if you cover this part up, now you see you have 4 terms here. So now you want to factor this by grouping. The GCF now of those 4 terms is 1. All right, now we're going to group the first 2 and the last 2. All right, so don't forget your bracket. So in the first group, what's the GCF? Well, the GCF is 4. So I'm going to say 4 times x minus 2y. Y'all agree? Because 4 times x is 4x, and then 4 times a negative 2y is a negative 8y. And then over here, I'm going to factor out the negative GCF, so it'll be, what's that, a. And so negative a, cover this up if you need to, negative a times x gives me this. And then a negative times a negative is a positive. Always double check. Negative times a negative is a positive. And I'm factoring out an a, so I'm left with a 2y. All right, and so if you look at this now, see they have an x minus 2y in common, so you're going to factor that out. So kind of like this, you're going to say x minus 2y. So if I factor in an x minus 2y, you're left with 4 minus a. 4 minus a. And then don't forget, you factor out an xy, so you got to have an xy out here. So now you see your 3 factors. Actually, there are 4 factors. X times y times x minus 2y times 4 minus a. And so rewrite this a little bit better. So you're going to say xy times x minus 2y times 4 minus a. So that'll be your answer. Okay? Now, just like we did in number 4, let's do it where you forgot about the GCF. So let's see if we get the same thing. So let me just kind of remind you. So the process is to do the GCF at the beginning, which we did here. All right. Now, you could have forgotten about that, and it's no big deal. You're just going to fix it at the end. So let me show you what's going to happen if you did forget about factoring out the GCF first. So we have 4 terms here, right? So we're going to do this by grouping. So I'm going to group the first 2, and I'm going to group the last 2. If I look at the first group, what's the GCF of the first group? Well, a 4, and then I need an x, and I need a y. So 4xy. Y'all agree? 4xy. All right, now, so remember when you factor out the GCF, you're writing as a product. 4xy times what polynomial gives me this back? All right, well, 4xy times x is this, because x times x is x squared. Minus and then 4 times 2 is 8. So I already factored out an x. I have 2 factors of y here. I factored out one of them, so I need one of them. Okay? All right, so that takes care of this. Always check, distribute to make sure you get this back. Then I'm going to remember you got to factor the negative symbol here because you must always use that middle sign as your sign here. So if you look at these two factors, there's an a, there's two x's here, one here, so I need one of them. So I'm going to factor out an ax and then a y. All right, so I'm factoring axy. And when I do that, let's see what happens. Negative axy times what term gives me this? Well, it's just x. A negative times a negative is a positive, so I need to put a subtraction symbol here. This is 2. I already factored out an a. I already factored out the x. There are 2 factors of y. I factored out one of them, so I need one of them. And always check. Axy, well, a negative times negative is a positive, so axy times 2y is 2ax, and then y times y is y squared. And so now I want you to notice is if you look at these two parts here, they both have x minus 2y in common. So I'm going to factor in x minus 2y, and then when I factor the x minus 2y, I'm left with 4xy minus axy. All right. Now here's a mistake some of you can make. So you're gonna say, all right, now I already have a product here, so I'm done. But remember, you must always check your factors to see if you factored completely. So if you look at x minus 2y, just those two terms, what's the GCF of those two terms? Well, the GCF is 1. But if you look at this, is the GCF here 1? No, it's not, because they both have an x and a y in those two terms. So that means that I can factor this part further. So you're going to factor out an xy from here, just like this, and then xy times 4 gives me 4xy minus, and then xy times a gives me axy. And so now, notice your answer is this times this times this. Except remember, always try and put the monomial part first. So we're going to get xy times x minus 2y times 4 minus a. All right? So again, just notice that if you forget to do the GCF at the beginning, it's no big deal. At the end is when you're going to catch it. All right, but remember, some students though, when they forget about the GCF, they get to this point and they think they're done. They forget. Some students forget about checking the factors to make sure that they can't factor further. All right, so you always look for that. Okay, let's look at number 6. So number 6, let's suppose we had this for number 6. All right, number 6. So let's suppose in number 6 we had this problem. We had 2x to the 4th minus 8x cubed plus 10x squared minus 40x. All right. Now again, I'm going to go ahead and do the process. So let's see what the GCF is. So I have 4 terms. I am going to try grouping, but let's do the GCF first. So if you look at those, they all have x's definitely, and then the coefficients are all even. So I know in this case the GCF is going to be a 2, and then what about the variable? 2x. So the GCF is 2x. I'm going to factor out the 2x. So when I do that, let's see what we get. 2x times what term is 2x to the 4th? Well, x cubed, because x times x cubed is x to the 4th. Minus 2 times 4 is 8. I'm factoring out in 1x. There are 3 here, so I need 2 here. Plus 2 times 5 is 10. I'm factoring out 1x. There are 2 here, 2 factors here, so I'm going to need 1, because x times x is x squared. 2 times 5 is 10. All right, so always check using distributive property. And then minus 2 times 20 is 40, and I already factored out the x, so I'm done, because 2x times a negative 20 is a negative 40x. All right, now, if you need to cover up your GCF here, now look at these 4 terms. So we're going to try and, remember 4 terms, you're going to try grouping. Let's group the first two and the last two and see what happens. All right, so in the first group, what's the GCF? Well, the GCF is x squared. All right, so I'm going to factor in x squared. And so x squared times x is x cubed minus x squared times 4 is negative 4 is negative 4x squared. Over here, I'm going to factor out a positive GCF. So it'll be a positive 5, and I get x. 5 times x is 5x. And then a 5 times a negative 4 is a negative 20. And notice these two are the same. And I'm going to go ahead and put, don't forget though that this is all in brackets and that's a 2x here. So don't forget to bring down the 2x. It's very easy to forget. Remember, you had a GCF, so in your answer, you better still have the GCF. So now I'm going to cover this up again. So now if I look at these two parts here, they both have x minus 4 in common. So I'm going to factor in x minus 4. And when I factor the x minus 4, I have x squared plus 5. But don't forget the GCF of 2x. And so there's your answer. You're done. All right, number 7. Number 7, let's suppose we had this for number 7. We had 3 x to the 5th y minus 9x to the 4th y minus 9x cubed y plus 27x squared y. All right? Okay, so let's go ahead and again do the GCF first. So I have this polynomial. I have 4 terms, so I know I'm going to end up at some point using grouping. But let's go ahead and do the GCF first. So if you look at your coefficients, 3, negative 9, negative 9, 27, the GCF of that is 3. If you look at your x's, is there x's in every term? Yes, there is. So I know I'm going to have some x's in my GCF. There are 5 here, 4 factors of x here, 3 factors here, 2 factors here. So I need 2. If you look at your y's, is there a y in every term? Yes, there is. 1 factor here, 1 factor here, 1 factor here, 1 factor here. So I need just 1 factor. So there's your GCF, 3x squared y. All right, so what you can do now is you're going to factor out the 3x squared y from every term. So 3x squared y times, all right. So I already factored out the 3, right? I have 5 factors of x. I factored out 2 of them, so I need 3 of them. Because x squared times x cubed is x to the 5th. And then I factor out the y, so I don't need any y's. Okay, now the next term, minus 3 times 3 is 9. I have 4 factors of x. I factored out 2, so I need 2 here. And I took out the y. I already factored out the y, so I don't need any more y's. Minus, again, 3 times 3 is 9. I factor out 2 factors of x. There are 3 here, so I need 1. And I already factored out the y, so I need any more y's. Plus 3 times 9 is 27. And then notice I have 2 factors of x here. I factored both of them out, and then I factor out the y. So there you go. That's all you need. Because 3x squared y times 9, to cover this part up the best you can. So notice 3x squared y times 9 is 27x squared y. All right, now what you're going to do is, you see those 4 terms? The GCF of those 4 terms is now 1. So we're going to group though, just like this. And so I get 3x squared y, don't forget to bring that down, times in brackets. Now let's get the first group. The first group, what's the GCF? Well, the GCF of the first group is x squared. So I get x squared times x is x cubed, minus, and then x squared times a negative 3 is negative 3x squared. Okay? And then from the other group, I can factor out a negative 3, and I get negative 3 times x is negative 3x, and then a negative 3 times a negative 3 is a positive 9. All right, now look at what you see here. So what do they have in common? Well, they have an x minus 3 in common, so you're going to factor it out, just like this. And so when I factor the x minus 3, you're left with x squared minus 3. And don't forget, though, to bring down the GCF. So it'll be 3x squared y times x minus 3 times x squared minus 3. So that'll be your answer. All right. Okay, let's do one more, number 8. So number 8, let's suppose we had 2a cubed minus 2a squared minus 2ax plus 2x. All right, so let's suppose we had that. Okay, so the GCF is 2, and then what about the variables? They don't, the variable a is not in all of them, and the variable x is not in all of them. So the only GCF here is what, 2? So it would be 2 times, and then when you factor out the 2, you get a cubed minus a squared minus ax plus x, right? Because 2 times all of this gives me this back. All right, now let's do factor by grouping with what's inside the brackets. So I'm going to group the first 2, group the last 2. So in the first group, what's the GCF in the first group? Well, the GCF is a squared. So I'm going to factor out an a squared. And when I do that, I get a squared times a is a cubed, and then a squared times a negative 1 is a negative a squared, right? Over here, I'm going to factor out a negative, and what's the GCF here? Well, that'll be a negative x. And so I get negative x times a is a negative ax, and then a negative times a negative is a positive, and then a negative x times a negative 1 is a positive x. And notice those two are the same. See the factors a minus 1? So you can factor out an a minus 1. And then when you factor out a minus 1, you get a minus 1 times a squared minus x. But don't forget the GCF. Remember, that's not the answer because all you've done here was factor this. But remember, you got to factor the original. So don't forget the 2. So I'm going to bring the 2 in each part. So see how I'm bringing it down? Just like this. Oops, don't forget the bracket here, though. I forgot a bracket. And then 2. All right, so there you go. There's your answer. So now, remember, look at the binomials here. See that GCF of a minus 1 is 1, and the GCF of x squared minus x is 1. So you're done. All right. So in this lesson, you basically was factoring by grouping. This first part, there was a previous lesson on that, so we kind of reviewed three items dealing with this, and then the rest was where the GCF was not 1. So just keep in mind, though, as you go through this, if you don't factor the GCF at the beginning, it's no big deal. You're just going to, just like we did here, at the end is where you would check each factor to see if you can go any further. All right, so if you don't factor at the beginning, you have to do it at the end. All right, so that's going to take care of this lesson, factoring by grouping.